Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. When Governor Cuomo granted clemencies to more than 100 men and women several weeks ago, he gave meaning to what the purpose of incarceration should be. Michelle Fine is a distinguished professor of social psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center. She wrote about the governor's actions in an op-ed piece, and I'd like to talk about that and other things today. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. Your specialty, basically, is social injustice.
I do participatory work with communities on policies that have inequitable consequences by race, by class, and by geography.
So, and one of those groups are people in prison.
One of those groups are people in prison.
Yeah. So what moved you about Judy Clarke and the whole concept of clemency and forgiveness and everything?
I guess I had a double motive for writing this piece. On the one hand, I was very taken by the courage of the governor. I thought it was a bold act to grant clemency and pardons to such a wide variety of young people and older folks in prison, but also the fact that he knew he was going to get a lot of backlash. And he knew he was going to get backlash in part for granting clemency for Judy Clarke, who, as you know, has a conviction that involved a violent crime and the death of a number of police officers. So I was taken by his courage. I have also known Judy since 1994. As a professor here at the Graduate Center, I've had the amazing opportunity to work with women and now men in prison and after prison on the narrow issue of college in prison and what a transformative intervention that is. And so I got to know Judy very well, and she's a remarkable person, as so many have testified.
So you really got to know what people in prison are like. I mean, I think the public has such a different perspective and perception of the whole thing. I thought that Cuomo's actions also hopefully are the beginning or is supporting this new recognition of how that we're keeping people in prison too much. Do you think it's a readjustment about people's
I think it's one of the first shots over the bow to say we need a different conversation about how much punishment is enough. Why are we sending so many people, particularly people of color, to prison? What are we doing with them when they're in prison? Under what conditions do they leave? And then how do we welcome them back to society? So I think the boldness of the governor's move was to open a conversation, in part about Judy, but a much broader conversation about reimagining issues of age, issues of bail, issues of Rikers. Those issues are all percolating, and those conversations are happening in policy offices and in communities. So in an otherwise kind of contentious times where we worry, I think some people are asking questions of have we gone too far with punishment as our primary policy strategy.
Do you think the American public is more attuned to this kind of morality? I don't understand their acceptance of this extreme punishment, especially compared to other countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was in anticipation of coming here, I re-looked at the case of the young man, the white nationalist in Norway who shot 77 people. I think his name was Breivik. And he got 21 years, which is the maximum in Norway. And there's outrage, not because he got 21 years, but because he's taking college courses at the University of Oslo in solitary confinement. So Norway is a country that incarcerates about 1/10 of the proportion of the population that we do, and the recidivism rate is a fraction of ours.
But they don't have the race question.
They don't have the race question, exactly.
So that's almost the evidence of what we do.
Yeah.
So you proved, though, that the value of education in prison that it is a valuable thing.
Yeah, no, 20 years ago we did an amazing project with women in prison as researchers with us, so it's what's called participatory research. Half of the researchers were at Bedford and half of us were here at the Graduate Center. We did the first systematic analysis of the impact of prison on the women, their children, correction officers, recidivism, public safety, and their children. And indeed, on all of those indicators, college and prison reduces recidivism. It encourages the children of prisoners to pursue education. Even correction officers who feel like it's unfair that they can't afford prison for their children, and these women get can't afford college.
Yeah.
Even they had to concede that college and prison reduces recidivism and creates a kind of peace in the prison.
It's not necessarily a national thing, is it? There are prison systems that don't have education courses in them?
Most do not. In 1994, then President Bill Clinton took Pell Grants out of prisons. So most prisons do not have college in prison. And yet, even, I would say, conservative Republicans should want to invest in this if we're serious about people not recidivating.
Right, and spending so much money per capita.
So much money.
It's incredible. So Judy Clarke was the one who was sentenced to 75 years, who has spent 35 years?
35.
And has taken advantage of, has done everything you're supposed to do to show what the purpose of prison was, right?
So Judy Clarke is a remarkable person. I don't know if you've met her. I believe maybe you have. She's remarkable in the people who are supporting her. The son of one of the murdered officers, rabbis, the superintendent of her of the facility. I think a dozen bar association chairs, the former chair of the parole board. There's a remarkable collection of people who have, and including the governor, who have noticed the dramatic transformation of who she is, her sense of responsibility, remorse, but also giving back, her leadership in the prison. I've been present when Judy has sparked conversations with other women about responsibility for their crimes.
And basically it also is the proper use of clemency, which is to make adjustments for missteps in the whole judicial process. And the judge in the sentencing part of Judy's incarceration said, you'll never be able to live in society.
Exactly.
And that's the basic point. She is.
I think the governor, in some ways, the governor and Judy have one thing in common, I think, that they both have provoked hard conversations about responsibility and punishment. How do we take responsibility for crimes, but how do we as a state think through our responsibility to recognize transformation and to give back? Judy has been active within Bedford, as so many of the articles have provided evidence. She is active in the infant center, in the children's center, in the summer camp, in the violence against women program, in the HIV program, in the dog program, the puppies program for returning veterans. She's a chaplain. She studies Kabbalah.
Right.
In some ways, a friend of mine, Lisa Sirocco, indicated we shouldn't even have to say all that, right? Because she is remarkable. But she has done 35 years. Her daughter was 11 months when she went in. Her daughter is now 36. There is no evidence, of course, that she would be a threat to public safety. And to the contrary, Judy has brought so many gifts of leadership to the prison. It's time for her to come out and do, as so many formerly incarcerated folks are doing, bring those gifts of leadership back to their communities.
She's a model for people in prison. This is what you should be doing.
A model.
You should get out and have that hope. You should live with that hope.
And denying her parole at this point would just shoot another voice of despair through the prison, where people look at her and say, here's a model prisoner. If she can't get out, why should I have any hope? So I do think every time the parole board slaps a woman or a man with another 2 years because of a crime they committed 20 years ago, which they can't change, it sends shockwaves through the prisons and through the kids of men and women in prison to say, what hope is there?
And extreme depression.
And extreme depression and morale. And
I mean, there have been attempts to change. Supposedly they've got a list of different things that you check off. But still, it's a question of what was your crime? And you start with that, which allows no room for forgiveness or for having earned something.
No,
recognition.
absolutely. The director of the Correction Association, I think Sophia was eloquent on this point, that if we keep trying people for their original crime, they're never going to get out. But if we start to value transformation, development, leadership, capacity, willingness to give back, then we have a different kind of ethic driving rehabilitation.
Right. So the governor's action didn't say to Judy, all right, you can go out. It sent her to the parole board, and now that's another hurdle for her.
Exactly.
And we're talking about the difficulty.
It dropped the sentence from 75 to 35 as the moment when she can
apply.
Come to the parole board.
And that's a big worry.
That's a big worry, of course.
But people in prison are not the only area of people that you're interested in and what happens to them, right?
No. I do lots of research with Muslim American young people. I have for the last
You started right after the World Trade Center?
Right after World Trade. A Muslim friend of mine, he was raised Muslim, Selçuk Shirin, who teaches at NYU, came to me and said, let's do some work on Muslim American kids. And I thought, I am entirely the wrong person. I'm a Jew. I should not be authoring anything written about Muslim American youth. And then I met them and I fell in love. And I thought, well, actually, as a Jew who's committed to the deep values of justice and inclusion and against occupations and discrimination, we have an obligation to raise these issues as well. So in 2004, we did a whole set of interviews with Muslim American youth in New York and New Jersey. And basically we found that they were like the Japanese interned kids who sent letters to a librarian when they got interned. There was a librarian in San Diego who said, write to me. So you can read those letters online, and they're beautiful. They're like, wait, I was an American citizen. I was playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, and then all of a sudden they told us we have to move. Same thing happened to these young Muslim American kids in the early 2000s. They were mostly middle and upper middle class, usually thought of themselves as white Americans. And suddenly, after the war on terror, they became suspect as oppressed or terrorist, or why are you wearing hijab? And they were beautiful young people who were willing to educate me and their colleagues, but they had been exiled from the community they called home. Different than how we have treated African Americans or Latinos in this country. They were a part of US culture, firmly embedded by class and mostly skin tone, and then all of a sudden they were exiled. We've started doing work now with Muslim Americans, and I have to say it's a much more sobering story. So now I'm talking to young people raised in the war on terror. You know that hate crimes have spiked, particularly in the last year. And now I'm meeting a group of young people who aren't so sure that they're welcome in this country, who feel like they have provisional membership in the nation, who are suspect about trusting police or teachers or public institutions. That's not what we found a decade ago. And so we've kind of corroded a sense of belonging.
So what do we do about that? The problem becomes more of the people who are not Muslims, right?
Yeah, I
And
think
acceptance.
we've got work in the same way that I wish that everybody who's watching this show could go to a college graduation in prison and meet the women and men, so that you can see in some ways there, but for the grace of God go I. You've got everybody, although huge racial disparities. I wish we could create more occasions, and we here at the Graduate Center are trying to create more occasions for people to come together across our differences, to recognize difference as a resource in this country, not as a reason to stay away or demonize. One of the optimistic movements in pretty pessimistic times is the amount of solidarities I'm seeing, particularly among young people, with Black Lives Matter, working with Muslim Americans, working with LGBTQ young people, working with undocumented youth, working with formerly incarcerated, around reimagining what could be.
And they work together.
They work together.
They don't see the differences.
they're certainly not as attuned to differences as our generation, but also they know that they are struggling against some of the same forces of privatization, of punishment, of hate, of greed. And they've got visions of what would CUNY look like if we all worked together? What would social policy look like? The other group that to get back to the prison work, that's been very active in reimagining policy are formerly incarcerated folks who have now just taken the lead on reimagining prison reform. And across this city, we are gifted with the brilliance of so many formerly incarcerated civic leaders, and I look forward to Judy Clarke joining those and many of the other people who were granted clemency, because they have a good sense of how to think about policy and practice and real lives on the ground. They know violence.
Even when people like Carrick go to prison and come out.
Exactly.
The former police commissioner. It's very interesting. It's good.
It's good.
It is really. Then the other group are immigrants in general.
Yeah.
They're another group that are living in fear, right? Or some of them.
Immigrants are for sure living in fear. Undocumented students and workers are for sure living in fear.
Are there undocumented students at CUNY?
Oh yes, many, proudly, boldly, and across the university, faculty, students, and some administrators have been arguing that we should be sanctuary sites for undocumented students. People are hoping that Obama will figure out some way in the 20 minutes he's got left to render them citizens. But they're not only worried about themselves, the DACA young people who, the deferred action students who trusted our government, gave their names, their phone numbers, their addresses, their families' names. They're worried that their families are vulnerable as well. Friends of mine who are teachers in Latino communities talk about kids having anxieties and fears, and we want to build structures where young people trust the public sector, trust government, trust teachers, trust police. We are not living in those times.
And instead, we're now living with fear.
We're living with fear. CUNY has always...
All of these people.
All of these people. And I have to say, as the child of immigrants, my parents came as children in the 20s at a time that Karen Brodkin Sachs called when the Jews became white. It was a time where public policy was welcoming folks who look like my parents, Jews from Poland, refugees from the war. So, but I look at the Statue of Liberty and I get teary, and then I feel guilty because I know no such welcome is coming for darker-skinned immigrants or Middle Eastern immigrants or folks who are coming in through the Mexican border.
So the people who voted for Trump, I mean, it's so incredible at what's going to happen at the end of this week. But you've talked to people who voted for Trump?
I have. Are
they people who show little tolerance for people in prison or for Muslims? Or
yeah.
Do we tie it all together, or what do we do?
So here's the most optimistic I can get at the moment.
Okay.
And usually I can get pretty optimistic, but these are hard times. So I was in rural Tennessee at the Highlander Center. Remember Miles Horton and Paulo Freire, and they owned the rights to We Shall Overcome, Pete Seeger's song. And there I met a number of men and women who are connected with coal mining country. And these were white working class folks who did not imagine that Hillary Clinton was going to help them very much, did not like the racism, misogyny of Donald Trump. But there were two things that he said that captured their imagination. He said he was bringing coal back, and he said he was bringing jobs back. One of the women I saw recently interviewed on television, and she said, I voted for Trump. He was bringing coal back, he was bringing jobs back, and now I see he's put a bunch of billionaires in his cabinet. He's not going to do either of those things, but he's going to repeal Obamacare. which is the only thing I really need. Obamacare is a special provision for black lung. She said, my father, my brothers, my husband, my sons have black lung, and we need that coverage. So I actually think the mobilizations around Obamacare, the fact that 22 million might be uninsured, I think veterans showing up at Standing Rock, I think we're seeing new solidarities forming. We're seeing formerly incarcerated folks embracing immigrant justice, people at Families for Freedom work on criminal justice and immigration justice. And I said to them, that's so interesting, you work on both systems. And they said, really, they're one system now. People who are working on education, school to prison pipelines, suspension disparities are now working with folks to close Rikers. So I think we're seeing new kind of the soldering of new solidarities.
So we're back to what George Washington said, that you must pay attention and be an active citizenry.
We are back
Obama.
to, exactly.
So there is something hopeful about that recent years there's been such a lack of involvement with government and voting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I'm not good at social media, but you know the hashtag stay woke? I think people are woke. I think there are very few people who are outside.
Who aren't seeing what's happening.
Who aren't seeing what's happening. I think plenty of white folks, it took us to see those horrendous videos of police shooting down black men and black women for us to recognize what our friends of color have been telling us for years. Shame on us, but I think nobody is outside the knowledge. Now it's up to really places like CUNY, public media, and public universities to create conversations about what we have in common and what's possible in the future. I think Octavia Butler and Ronnie Eldridge are doing a good job of helping us imagine what could be.
Nobody is doing what you can do. We talked in 2011.
Yeah.
And I looked at the program.
Yeah.
And we talked about the same things,
Yeah.
you know. But you worried especially about media. You talked about Fox News Network.
Yeah.
You were very optimistic about the internet and the use of it.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way? Back and forth.
Boy, in 2011, I think Bill Moyers had recently been our graduation speaker at the Graduate Center. And he gave a gorgeous talk about the intimate interdependence of public education and public media, that we need both to sustain democracy. So I was kind of high on a Bill Moyers thing. You know, the internet runs in like every other element of society. There have been terrible consequences to the internet, and it has certainly split audiences. There is a kind of violence, hatred, and vitriol on the internet that I know we've all seen. We've seen it for Judy Clarke. I've seen it for myself when I was involved in challenging corporate takeover of public education. There's a kind of bloody hatred in those trolls that are very discouraging. On the other hand, the kind of staccato sense of possibility with Arab Spring, with Standing Rock, with Occupy, with Black Lives Matter, that kind of mobilization across space, indigenous groups mobilizing across, people with disabilities mobilizing across.
It's amazing.
LGBT that was not possible, particularly I have to say around three groups I care a lot about, people with disabilities, indigenous groups, and LGBT folks, that there's a kind of mobilization across that wasn't possible before social media.
And you can see that over 200,000 people have already registered to march in Washington.
Exactly.
There are marches all over the country.
Exactly. And that the Obamacare marches yesterday are important because it included a lot of people who voted for Trump.
It did.
And so I think new sinewy connections are developing. It'll take a while, but we got to build back democracy. It is a long arc, and as King told us.
It definitely is. So we're going to have very hard times coming up, we think. And I hope you'll come back and we can sort of trace it as we go along and talk about it. All right?
Absolutely.
Good.
I look forward. Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Michelle Fine.
Thank you.
We at CUNY TV always like to hear from our viewers. So if you have any subjects you'd like to explore or people you'd like to hear, please let us know. Write to us at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or go to our website, cuny.tv, and click on Contact Us. We look forward to hearing from you.